Hello everybody and welcome to this Monday masterclass session where we're going to be talking all about your story and why it matters with Marianne. So for those of you who might be joining us for the first time, I'm Simon Batchelor. I'm one of the co-founders of Better, Bolder, Braver, and I am hosting this discussion with Francis. And today we're joined by Marianne, who we will introduce shortly. So while everybody gets into the room, gets comfortable and works out where they're going to sit and what they're going to do, let's find out where everybody is joining us from. We've had a lot of snow across the UK here. I see Rob is asking whether anybody's got any snow. I have had no snow here in Brighton. We very rarely ever see snow, so it's a no snow from me. Has anybody else got any snow?
It's a no snow from me. I love that. I really like the creative way in which Craig is turning up today. He's not telling us where he is, but he's spelt colour, in a certain way that's inviting us to guess. So thanks for that slightly creative way of, checking in this morning, Craig. Today is really interesting because, oh look, snow here. That's my story, Craig, yes. Hi, Carlos. As is the beauty of any good story, Carlos, you should be able to kind of come in at any point and it will hit you with creativity and joy so that you can catch up. My voice is quiet. Craig is always the one to point that out. Does that sound better, Craig? Okay. So today, as Simon has said, we're talking a little better. Okay, I'll try and sort this one out. Just while I try and sort it out, I wonder, Simon, would you like to just give people a sort of overview of our approach to story? We've obviously talked about it in a Monday masterclass before, but just to get everyone warmed up, and Marianne as well, let's do a bit of an introduction about our own take on story while I try and sort out the volume and the hiss, which is maybe down to me.
Well, in terms of story, there's one thing I think in marketing that really helps set you apart, and that is your story. So even if you do what someone else does on the tin, as it were, if someone else does the same thing as you, they don't necessarily have the same story as you, or they're incredibly unlikely to. And I think in finding and telling your story, you can start to connect with your ideal customer in a way that they may not have been sort of interacted with or spoken to before, because it gets them involved in you and your business and your process and who you are and what you do. And your story is just a great way of doing that, I find. So there's an element of the story which sort of is a journey, and there's an element of the story which draws people in. But there's, I think, an element of storytelling that just makes people feel safe and they know where they are in that process. So by sort of inviting people to come in and using a story structure, you can get people in on a journey that they're like, oh, okay, well, I see where you sit in that, I see where I sit in that, I see where everybody else sits in that, and therefore they feel safe and part of that journey. So when we talk about story, we use it in our sort of marketing learning around sort of helping take your ideal client on a journey of trust, to not knowing you, to knowing you, to really trusting with you, to want to come with you on their journey. So yeah, that's kind of where we stand on story, I guess, is our sort of summary of it. So to kind of get us started, Marianne, do you want to give us a little bit of an introduction to you and your background to writing and story?
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say, thankfully, Simon, everything you've just shared, like I do agree with, like pretty much it would be awkward if I was like, well, no, that's not story. So yeah, I am. So I've worked as a kind of professional writer for about the last 20 years, but I've sort of been going through a bit of a career transition over the last few years. And as part of that, really just exploring the whole idea around story, identity, purpose, meaning, just the small stuff, nothing too big. Who are you at your core? How do you embody your sacred purpose? Just the standard Monday kind of thinking, I suppose. So yeah, I've definitely been on a journey around what my, like, even understanding and making sense of my own story, I suppose. And I should say, like, it's still very work in progress. So I'm not here to be like, I don't have the shiny, finished, polished version of like, this is who I am, this is everything about me. So I guess hopefully by sharing it, I've sort of shown like, you don't, like, I don't think you necessarily ever get to a finished version of this is my story and this is who I am. So yeah, it is all in a day's work, Carlos. It really like it kind of really is purpose of life stuff. Yeah, that kind of thing. So I was thinking a little bit about the role of story. I'm actually going to start with this is kind of a tangent, but this is something that I was thinking about over the weekend. So I went to someone's birthday party yesterday, and they had it in a forest, which was kind of really nice. It was also really, really, really cold. And we were doing some whistling. Like, I had a very wholesome Sunday afternoon. I was in a forest with my dog and some people, and I was whittling. I don't have it handy. A small animal. And the guy who was running it kind of was gave us all the knives, and he gave us all the safety instructions about make sure you put the knife in the sheath and like put your hands on your elbows while you're doing it so you don't accidentally open your femoral artery. And it just, I know, right? And it reminded me of when I was 9 and I bought my granddad a candle for Christmas. And on the bottom of the candle, it had all these safety instructions for a candle, like, don't leave unattended and this, that, and the other. And I read those instructions when I was 9, and I was like, oh, well, this looks pretty serious. So when I did the gift card to my granddad, who, by the way, at that time was probably about 70, had fought in the Second World War, and was quite a competent and capable, build a shed, do this, that, and the other guy, and said, Grandad, make sure you read the safety instructions, because I really didn't want him to miss them. So anyway, it got me thinking that as a child I was like this quite risk-averse human. And I suppose like the reason that I'm telling you a random story about whittling and candles and my granddad is like, I think sometimes story is just the most interesting way into a topic, right? So so my specialism isn't particularly about taking risks, but if I were a coach that was talking about taking risks or whatever, and I could say, I've moved from being a very cautious, risk-averse human into being this, that, and the other. Like, I could say it like that, or I could kind of tell a story that sort of illustrates actually where I've come from and where I'm going to. So right now, as a kind of a, entrepreneur running my own business, like, yeah, I probably do take loads of risks all the time and don't even think about it. So, yeah, I guess I've really been thinking about, like, the telling stories is just, it's just like a more personal way into it, isn't it? It's just a more personal way to say this is kind of who I am and this is what I'm about. So I don't necessarily have my big origin myth of this is everything about me, but yeah, I think the more I can start to tell stories, and I think that's true for everybody, then hopefully it's just a way of kind of getting to know and understand, like who the person is that you're actually communicating with.
There's a couple of things that you're talking to, which I'm so glad you've already brought into this, because it means we've got more time. You've kind of powerfully packed a punch in sort of telling us a story and getting us to this stage already, which is fantastic. And you're talking to something that I think for coaches is really key. And if anyone is still experiencing sound stuff, please let me know, because I'm not a technical expert. So it'd be great to know if it's my end that needs adjusting. Thank you. So for coaches, I think this whole concept of thanks, Chris. Simon, just let me know what I'm supposed to be doing and I'll do it.
No, it sounds all right.
Okay, great. Thank you. This whole concept that coaches, I think, struggle slightly with in terms of stories is around the sort of authenticity, vulnerability, honesty, and framing thing. How can you be authentic? How can you bring the best version of yourself that people are going to resonate with without sort of overspilling, oversharing, giving too much away and compromising your boundaries? So that's one thing that I think you've touched on. The other thing is that we wanted for you to describe the transition that you're in between having done a huge amount of work in helping people tell their stories into the work that you're doing much more of now around sort of identifying your purpose. And obviously you're going to be talking to Carlos and Lawrence about that on Friday, so it's a lovely Marianne week, which makes me think about sort of chapter 1 and chapter 2, you know, the transition that you're on, the ability to articulate transition and to sort of honestly say, I've been here and I've done that and now I'm about to do this, and here's why what I did relates to what I'm doing next is so important. If you talk about just where you're at now and you can't bring into it, as we call it, your authority, empathy and your own journey, then it's harder for you to stand out as an expert in the where you are now. Whereas if you're happy to talk about chapter 1, and as we've invited you to tell us all about your previous life, as it were, then it's really compelling for people. They really understand why they're listening to Marianne today in talking about story and not just purpose. Right? Why listen to Marianne? Why is she qualified to talk about identifying your purpose? But it's everything that you've done to now and the way in which you tell the story, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. And in terms of so if I think about my story, I suppose the kind of the core of my story, and I think probably the core of anyone's story, is kind of about all the places that have been a bit hard. Because if you think about it, like, good stories are never like, you know, oh yeah, someone goes out on an adventure, everything goes fine, and they come back. That's it. There are no dragons. You know, that's just, like, you're not going to watch that on Netflix. You'll be like, oh, there's just a person walking around having coffee. So I guess there's something about sharing, like, what's been hard. So in my instance, like, I've been a writer for lots of years, and so I suppose the story of where I am now starts with, like, a burnout. So it starts with something that was really hard, like working for a creative agency, putting a lot of time and energy into that, like probably a little bit too much, kind of overworking, out of kind of anxiety about the kind of job situation, and at a certain point kind of going, actually, do you know what, I can't really do this anymore. There's always dragons in there somewhere, Chris. Like, you just have to, you have to know what they are. So yeah, I guess this sort of, so as I move into this idea of, like, talking about story, talking about purpose, talking about joy, like, it's not because I've always found those things really easy. Like, I find it really hard to talk about myself and what I'm doing. I found it, like, I've really struggled to know what my purpose and role in life has been. Like, they're not the things that necessarily come super easily to me. So it's definitely been, like, a bit of a journey. So part of the journey, journeys are, oh God, it's like a bit X Factory, isn't it? Which has now been cancelled, which is probably a good thing. But, it's our journey, it's our quest, it's our adventure. It's this thing that we're doing called life. So for me, in a way, the first step was sort of understanding my own story and where I'd come from. And I actually did that in a very literal way. So I trained as a therapist. And part of my assignment was in the first year to write an autobiography of the years 0 to 20 and just kind of go, okay, here's everything that happened in the first 20 years of my life. That was my first year assignment. The second year assignment, and I don't recommend doing this on your own, but it was a very interesting activity, was to go back and look at every event, whether good or bad, and kind of go, well, what was the gift of that? Like, and there might be really tough stuff in there. There might be things that are really hard or things that you kind of might wish hadn't happened. But out of everything, what was the gift? What was the skill? What was the thing that you got really good at because this thing happened? And like I say, that could be technically a negative thing or technically a positive thing, but it's almost like reinterpreting your own story to find, like, I'm the person that I am, not just because of the things that have gone well, but because of the things that have been really tough. And I guess, Francis, you said about, like, how to share authentically and honestly without oversharing. I think there is a little bit, if you really want to work with your story in all kinds of different ways, I think there probably is a little bit of, like, that self-reflection piece first and going, well, what is my story? How can I, like, reframe some of my challenges, and how can I start sharing some of the gifts? Does that make sense?
Completely. This is the work that we encourage people to do, and absolutely, as you say, if you haven't done that reflection piece, and I find myself now saying this at least once a day, so I'm boring myself, and I can't imagine how everyone else is feeling about it. Just a bit of feedback there. It sounded much better when you muted for a sec, Simon, so I don't know what that's saying. I don't know what that means. It might be, as Craig thought, possibly a bit loud at your end. God knows, because I'm not in any way an expert. But yeah, so another effing self-growth tool, which comes from Carlos. Carlos started the another effing self-growth tool movement, as far as I'm concerned, although it could have been a story I made up in my head that this is a Carlos concept. But we talk about marketing as another effing self-growth tool the whole time, in that you cannot possibly do half of it, at least half of it, if you haven't done the work first on yourself. So in just on the point that you've just made, if you haven't stopped and thought, which bits of my story have I grown from, which I can then sort of articulate in a way that's helpful to other people, and as we describe, stops sort of positioning you as the hero, but rather as the guide, then, you know, it can go a whole way to helping other people understand, giving them something to identify with, and therefore allowing you to provide a service that people are willing to pay for. You know, so without the work first, it's impossible. And for some people, that's really not a problem. So anyone that's been in psychotherapy or done a lot of self-reflection, or is very emotionally intelligent, or, you know, is very happy and used to talking about, thinking about what they've done and how that might be of service to other people, fabulous. You know, but what's interesting, I think, is for those of us who, you know, who really might struggle with some of this stuff, have not done any work at all before, have really felt empowered in many ways to help other people and become coaches, and then are in a situation where they're being invited to tell a story about their previous life. And it's like, no thanks, don't really want to be oversharing about stuff that's come before. And making that transition, and getting people to a point of comfort where they can talk about something that's happened to them, and you know, if they've been in a very professional environment, they might be an executive coach, it might be entirely unfamiliar to them to then be coming into a room and talking about their personal life or story, or, you know, sense of failure in the professional way, in order to make other people feel empowered. You know, that's a big transition for a lot of people, isn't it? So
yeah, it is. And I mean, I think, you know, my sense of that is like, it doesn't have like not to go from 0 to 100, not to go from I am completely professional and I am never going to share anything, to like, blah, here's everything. Like, you know, it's fine to take these small steps, I think, and that's certainly how I'm kind of like, that's how I'm doing it. And, you know, and you know, like I've like written stories for, like, I don't know, I mean, Magnum ice cream and the post office and Prudential. Like, I've done loads of that kind of corporate storytelling. I've done like 3 years of psychotherapy training. I've done this, that, and the other. And I still have to work really hard at remembering, you know, but what is my story, and like which bits of it are the right bits to share. And some of it comes from like, so one thing that I find really useful, like there's no neutral viewpoint, right? Whenever you're kind of choosing to tell a story about yourself, and whether you're doing it for yourself in the first place or for other people, you're always making choices about how you frame it. So like maybe I can give an example. Like, so like I could talk about there are different ways I could talk about what's happened to me in the last sort of 4 years. So one way is I could sort of talk about, okay, well, I worked at this creative agency. I had a really big burnout. It was a total disaster. Like, I started at this agency, they all loved me, but by the end I had a big burnout and I had to leave, and it felt really frustrating and difficult and challenging. And I spent the last sort of 4 years trying to change my career, but, you know, actually feeling a bit frustrated and a bit stuck and not getting anywhere. So I could tell, and that is, I have told myself that story quite a bit over the last 4 years. Or here's an alternative. I could say, I worked for a creative agency. I learned so much from them. I had like massive clients with massive budgets, which meant that when I left, I was able to set up my own business and be really successful. I haven't always enjoyed every bit of work I've done over the last 4 years, but what I have been able to do is train as a psychotherapist, do a whole bunch of self-development work, start training as a purpose guide, and ultimately kind of walk towards like the thing that I most care about. And in having a few years of feeling frustrated and stuck, I feel so much more equipped to work with people who are in a similar place. So like same events, same stuff, but how do I, and this is the bit like, how do I choose to tell the story to myself so I can then go out and tell it to other people? and if it's hard emotionally, like I probably had to do a year of just being really angry at my old employer. Do you know what I mean? I didn't go straight to, oh, isn't it great that I had burnout? I was like, oh, I hate them.
100%.
There were lessons.
And it's so energizing to listen to you, and you're making me think about my story, you know, which I'm happy to talk about now, because, you know, I'm with you in that I've done the work, and, you know, it's making me think about job interviews as well, and how you can show up in a job interview and have someone ask you, why aren't you there anymore? How come you left after 4 months? And it's like, oh shit, that question. And, you know, we all have to learn how to sit there and sort of say, yeah, no, that was a really, really interesting one, and I'm so happy it happened, and all the rest of it. But it takes a lot of containment and processing. And as you say, you know, work. Well, I feel, in fact, that the work in practicing it and in telling the story is part of the work itself. So there's the bit of work that you do first in order to know how to tell the story. But then I think there's something of the practice of telling the story that sort of, if I talk again and again and again, how pleased I am that I did Eleanor Tweddle's Another Door course, which brought me to the Happy Startup School, which brought me to Simon, which made me and Simon come up with Better, Bolder, Braver. You know, the more that you talk about this, the more you tell the story, the more you're telling yourself. And, you know, I think this speaks to some chat in the chat about, is the story for you, and is the story for them? And I think it's not that it has to be first for you, then it can be for someone else. I think the story sort of evolves because you're telling it. So there's like a coexistence in the story that you're telling yourself and the story that other people are receiving, and the key to it is to be really close to it, so that you can iterate the story for yourself and for others in a way that's going to be nourishing continually for you and for others. And we say to people, look, niching is for now. Another thing that coaches are really struggling with sometimes is sort of, how can I possibly think of one audience that I want to wed myself with and focus on? And we say, don't worry, just do it for now. But also we say to people, if you've had the same niche for 10 years, you've got to ask yourself, are those people still the ones that are serving you for where you are in your life? And, you know, if you're able to tell a story iteratively, then you can make sure that you are checking in with yourself as to whether or not the story is making sense. Like, is the next chapter, as you're telling it now, actually serving you because of what's come before and what you want to come in the future? Yeah, so story as a psychotherapeutic meditative practice is something I think is a great concept.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm sort of noticing lots of interesting questions in the chat. Craig, I will just say haiku. I mean, if I ever run a writing workshop, and like, I mean, that would be my big tip, is almost like to, well, I guess a bit like you say, Francis. Well, there's two things, isn't there? So there's the kind of, it's this idea that a story is living and alive, and as you tell it, it kind of keeps growing. And I think that when it feels unmanageable and overwhelming and there's lots of bits and pieces, you can always kind of keep stripping it back to the core elements. But I think there's almost like a sense, there's a myth that you're meant to have your one story that you tell, that you're meant to have, like, this is it, this is the story of me. But actually it is going to shift and change with every telling. It should be alive and living. You are going to kind of reinterpret events as you go.
Should we, this chat is chatty, isn't it? Should we pick apart, let's say, Craig's sort of series of questions and ask you to respond to each of them? Craig says, am I telling stories to show something about me as a guide? I'll just read the next bit as well. Or am I picking a point I want to show and selecting a story to point to that? And he's qualified further. In other words, which comes first in choosing a story and how to tell it? The actual story, or what I want the readers to think and feel about me or my work afterwards? What are your thoughts?
So a really good question. So in my copywriting world, which is where I write for businesses, then I would always be telling people to, you know, think about your audience, think about your reader. What do you want them to know? How do you want them to feel? What do you want them to do? That would always be like my planning tool. So, you know, start with the reader, start with the audience. And I think for sort of a specific marketing piece, like that probably is really helpful, important. You're giving yourself a little bit of focus. And like, so this is the kind of psychotherapist, purpose guide, navigate by joy person in me also says, if you have a really interesting story that you want to tell, like, it might be okay just to tell it too without knowing exactly who it's for and how it will land for them. So that's the least helpful answer ever, because I basically said both. But I think it kind of depends a little bit. Like, I think it's fine sometimes to be very targeted and very specific. I want you to know this about me. I want you to feel like this at the end of our interaction. Here, I've got the perfect story to tell you. Boom, done. And maybe you have like a whole bank of those stories. But sometimes I think it is okay just to be a little bit intuitive and trust that if you've got an interesting story to tell, it will connect with people on some level. You kind of can't plan or control for all of it. People will hear it how they want to hear it. That would be my take. Francis, Simon, you might wildly disagree.
Not only do I agree, but you've brought another third dimension in, which is to what degree can you mould yourself, or should you mould yourself? And it's making me think about how I'm quite trusting of people when I tell them things. I entrust information with people in a way that I think not everyone does, and that's fine, and some people are really careful and sort of don't feel comfortable about the idea of someone taking your story further in their own head. They kind of want to control it all and make sure that the information that they need is there for them in the way that they've chosen to present it, whereas I'm rather more optimistic and trusting about, give someone an inch and they can run a mile with it if they want. But so it's that thing of, not only, yes, there is the idea of a marketing strategy in life, but we very much echo what you say, which is have it in mind, but then there's also the you in the situation, and you can't just be told what good looks like in terms of the tactics and ignore completely the subjective, personal, human element of it all. And I would also just say we're all different, and we bring, for example, to storytelling a degree of trust or hope that someone else might differ in. So it's that kind of emotional place from which we're doing either the strategic marketing thing or the story, as Craig says, the story with me as a guide, as a motivation thing. There's a lot of energy in there as well, which might shape how it's received or where it goes next.
Yeah, I mean, I think looking at the question, I think there's probably two parts to it, in the sense that I think, picking up slightly on what Chris has said, about actually writing down your story as a process, and obviously, Marianne, you said about writing down 0 to 20 for you, which is, what an experience. I think there is an exercise and there is a lot of work and things to learn and discover from just trying to tell your story from way back when to now. But I would picture that very few people will ever read the story end to end to anybody else. Because, unless you are a person of note in public figure, no one's really going to be that interested in all of it. That doesn't discredit the story. But where the skill lies and where the interest lies is in picking the bits that are relevant for the audience. So be that marketing, where you're like, okay, well, yes, I worked here, and yes, I did that, and yes, I did this, and yes, I did this, and you can go on and on and on. It was the thing I learned very early on in my career with a CV, is like, don't put everything on the CV, because then they just pull it apart. Just put the bits that are relevant to that job. And it's that thing, isn't it, of in the way that you play to the crowd, and there is an element of crafting a story, and maybe you might like to craft 2 or 3 stories. You've got one for sort of friends and family who aren't customers in many way, or aren't going to become clients but just are interested. Then you've got a sort of friends who might know someone who might like to get involved one day, and then you've got someone who really you think could make an excellent client and you'd like to engage with and know more. And of those 3 flavours of the story, you'll pull out and put in different bits depending on what suits it. So I think maybe there's an element of both at play when writing a story. And Carlos said it very succinctly earlier when you said, is the story for me or we? And I would say, well, it's for both, but you don't necessarily want to place all of the me story on the we. If you don't want to have to tell your entire story every time, because that could it would take ages, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and just to say, I definitely don't recommend writing autobiography and sharing it with people. Like, that's not it. It's like, that's not. Don't do that.
Yeah.
Like, write it. If you want it, as an exercise, it can be helpful to reframe and understand your own story. But once you've got that, then yeah, you're going to make some really careful selections about what you do and don't want to kind of take from that, for sure. There's definitely a few stages to that, I think.
This is making the CV thing. I love it. I'd never thought about a CV as a good analogy for a story, but I had a light bulb moment when somebody explained to me I didn't need to have a chronological CV, I could have a functional CV, because I was really struggling with trying to articulate. I now am very happy to be able to talk about a squiggly career where on retrospect everything makes perfect sense, but at the time I was wondering how on earth it linked to the thing before and what I wanted to do next, and that was really stressing me out in terms of being, going to job interviews, etc., or talking to the uncle at the Christmas party who asked me what am I doing with myself, and now I can talk. I have a CV that's, I don't actually have a CV anymore, thank God, but where I'd have to have a CV, it would be a functional one which has themes, strengths and skills that I would like to bring to a job, and then underneath it I would be illustrating those skills and strengths with bullet point examples of what's happened in my life that speaks to that skill. And I'm wondering how, if we can move on from having talked about doing the work in order to sort of tell the story with a sense of sort of self and a sense of safety, can we talk about maybe some of the stylistic things that you, as an excellent storyteller and now a purpose pioneer, are kind of encouraging people to think about? Are there different, the equivalent of functional CV skills that you'd like to talk about today?
Well, I guess, there's probably a few things. So I guess like the more kind of concrete and tangible and real and specific something is, then the easier it is to picture. I think sometimes, so I know like in the corporate world, there's loads of like business jargon that everybody uses, and we're going to leverage our synergies to do our end-to-end, and you're like, oh God, I just, what? I think sometimes, I'm curious, I guess, but I feel like in the cultural world as well, that there are these words and phrases that everybody uses, and it's not that they're bad words or phrases, but they just kind of can be a little bit if everybody's using them, it can get a little bit meaningless. So I guess the specificness of it, and then the more visual language. So like thinking, I know that my forest story at the beginning was a bit, you're like, why is she telling a story about being in the forest? But like that's kind of like, I guess that kind of visual, tangible, like I can picture something happening, can be a really helpful thing to think about when you're telling a story and making it quite specific. The other thing that so there's a really lovely poet called Mark Nepo who writes really beautiful poetry, and I heard him talk once about how when you're talking about what you do, so 90% of people who want to talk about what does it mean to have a story, 90% of the time it is about how do I answer that question, what do I do for a living, and it is really hard, isn't it? I like this idea of using verbs, not nouns, right? So it can be very easy to get caught up in an identity. And again, I'll give you an example from my own life. So as well as doing everything that I do, quite busy actually, I used to be a playwright, as that was one of the things I used to do, and I used to really like being a playwright. And I used to say, oh yeah, hi, I'm Marianne, I'm a playwright, and I used to really enjoy that. But I got a little bit too caught up in the identity of I'm a playwright, and then when I sort of was writing plays and they weren't I wasn't able to make the leap from one level to the next, I got a bit stressed because I'm a playwright and I need to do so the idea of verbs, not nouns, so doing words, not the kind of identity being words, if you like, is sort of a really helpful way to kind of not be over identified with a role and get too stuck in it almost. Because if you're like, oh, I'm a XYZ coach, and then you can feel like, oh well, I have to do things like that. Whereas if you're like, okay, so now for example, I write poetry, I write songs, I create joyful communal events online and offline to bring people, blah blah blah. And that for me starts to feel a little bit more alive actually. And then if one day I stop writing poetry, it doesn't matter, because I'm not identifying with I have to be a poet or I have to be a songwriter. I'm doing those things at the minute. So I think that's quite, well, that for me is an interesting part of story. And the doing words are always going to be interesting, because you're like doing something and there's action and there's, maybe some adventure in there, maybe some dragons,
I love that, because people don't ask you, what are you? They say, what do you do? And it's like, so you're even being given permission, you're being invited to talk about what are you doing today. It's like, I am not a dragon. It's like, today I'm doing some dragoning.
Yeah, exactly. And, we're all in these interesting worlds where, like, we don't have this answer of like, oh, I'm a lawyer, I'm a teacher, well, maybe we are as well, that's fine if we are. But like, we might not be, we might not have that easy answer. So it can feel really uncomfortable. But yeah, I think the doing words can be quite helpful for that.
I love that. And I'm thinking about I was just listening this morning to the Happy Startup School Friday Fireside, which unfortunately I was not able to listen to live, which was around neurodivergent identification with Matthew Bowinger. And something you've just said, I just thought it was so profound. Do listen to it. It was brilliant, with Carlos and Lawrence and Matthew and others in the Happy Startup School community. But there was something about labelling and sort of how toxic that can be and how dangerous that can be. And Matthew or someone else said it's kind of like, how is this useful for you? Like, how is this description of something going to be useful for you? Because you kind of retain ownership of the why. Like, why are you looking to seek this way of describing yourself? And I think if we can hold on to that as for coaches, why do you want to describe yourself in this way? It reminds us that it's not just because we need a label, because other people need to label things, but because if we're clever about it, it can be descriptive in a way that serves us back, because others will understand what our needs are and the needs that we see in them, which is what we're looking to help coaches get closer to. It's their own, for their own sustainability. It's kind of continually asking yourself what your values and boundaries and limits and interests are, and then it's working out how you can talk to people who you want to surround yourself with in a way that makes them understand that you're the best guide for them, and that's why they might like to be in your life. So I just wanted to make that comparison because it came to me in what you were saying.
Yeah, and I think, I guess it's easier to see it in an identity that might feel harder to talk about or less understood or less accepted. You might kind of go, oh, yeah, actually, this, what does this, there are going to be elements of a label that's useful and there might be elements that aren't. I think with the positive labels, it can be hard to think, well, what's the problem with it? But I think if we kind of get too fixed or too rigid, then it's harder to tell then it sort of feels like, oh, I'm caught in this place. Like I can, this is who I am, so I can't possibly go outside of that. And like interesting stories do go off on a tangent. So in my old job, I was desperate to be a creative director. So that was part of the problem. I was desperate to have that was why I was working these crazy hours. I started out as a senior writer and I felt pretty good about that. And then my friends people I was working with got promoted to creative director, and I was like, well, I want to be that. And then and that was really that was really bad. And now I've been on this massive instead of going from senior writer to creative director, I've gone senior writer. I've just wandered through a whole pine forest of completely reinterpreting everything about my childhood, thinking more deeply about purpose, coming to Happy Start School. And I'm somewhere much more interesting and different. So yeah, I guess that's why even the so-called good labels can be a little bit unhelpful, if that makes sense.
Nice. Like the way you weaved the forest analogy into that. It was almost like you knew what you were doing when you started out telling us about the forest.
It makes it sound like I had a plan, which...
It's wonderful, isn't it, how at the end you can say, and that's why I wanted to tell you the story about the forest. And it's like, wow, how did you do that? But you're making me think about what it is to be a parent as well, and how kids need to have these sort of creative explanations. Or you're trying to think as a parent, what is the story I can tell you so that you can understand this? It's often the equivalent of a forest, or an animal, I don't know what, in order that they can go, okay, yeah, right. And, they keep asking why, and it keeps you going, oh, why? Ooh, why? And then the story just becomes more and more existential and profound. But it's because you're trying to explain. And yeah, as well, how would you do this for a child? What's the story for the child? Simon, what are you saying?
Well, I think the labelling thing's really interesting because it's like, if you sort of think of it as like a signpost, it's a really good way if you're putting your story out, not necessarily directly as a story, let's say. So you haven't written a blog which is just your story, but let's say you're trying to present in a live scenario like this, and you're telling people what you do and why you do it and things like that. Then signposting where you've come from that might be relevant to that audience, or where you're going, then sometimes those labels can be really useful. But I totally see what you mean about the kind of, you can paint yourself into a corner by saying, well, I'm this and I'm that. And sometimes it does take letting go of that in order that you can actually tell your story. Because sometimes you can't tell a story because you're like, oh, well, I don't have a story to tell because I'm just a ... So I don't have a story to tell because I just do this. And it's like, okay, well, if that's where you're coming from, that's like stage one of the story. But then it's unpacking that a bit further into like, okay, so yes, you're just but then what? And it's that thing of thinking about the kids of like, well, why? Why? And I guess it's just that asking, and I guess evolving that story is what takes time. And sometimes there are bits that you can be very attached to that take years and years to stop talking about. So, for example, for me, I worked for years in location sound in film, TV, adverts. I did TV mixing for many years in Soho, but it's a part of my story that I just don't tell anymore unless I've had a couple of pints and people want to know about it. But it's not part of my main story, do you know what I mean? It's not that kind of main narrative to where I am now and where I'm going, but it doesn't detract from the fact it has happened and there's lots of amazing stories still sat there to tell. But I don't feel the need to bring it up very often because it's not part of where I'm going at the moment. Obviously, it's part of me and part of my story. So I think that sort of loops us back round to Craig's question earlier of, there's all this exciting stuff that kind of happened, good and bad. Not all of it, is, rainbows and unicorns, but it doesn't have to all be negative. It doesn't all have to be positive. And both of them can form where you are now.
You're making me think about the money stories thing that Carlos is an expert on in the Happy Startup School. Just calling it money stories invites people to sort of as a coach, as a storyteller, I think it's also our responsibility to be able to ask questions of people that relate to a particular kind of story for them. And as soon as you label it as like the money, well, we've talked about how labelling's not so great, but as soon as you call it, for example, the money story, there's certainly a couple of people in our community, the Better Bolder Braver community, who are thinking hard about their relationship with money and pricing, as there are in the Happy Startup School community, and sort of giving the stories a name and the invitation to come and think about them makes you think about and remember stuff that you haven't remembered for a very long time, or as Simon says, recount bits of your life that you may not normally put into your average elevator pitchy story. And in doing so, and in being given the space and the invitation to come and talk about a story that speaks to a particular theme like money, can open up, a whole can of worms, but therefore also some really amazing growth opportunities for people. So is our job as storytellers also to say, this is the bit of our story which relates to, let's think of something else, intergenerational gifting. It's like, what do you mean? Okay, so I'm going to tell you a bit of a story about the intergenerational gifting that I feel and how it relates to where I am now. What's your intergenerational gifting story? It's like, okay. And, then suddenly you're invited to think about something that you may not have thought might affect your coaching or your idea of your purpose. So, yeah, I like that too. Have you experienced that yourself, Marianne?
I guess, well, I suppose where again, this is so I'm like, oh, which I like have my little mental like Rolodex of like, is this therapy? Is this copywriting? Is this like, so I kind of, when you talk about that, I guess I bring my kind of therapy perspective to it in a way, which is that we're all telling stories about the world all the time, like whether we know that they're running or not, like we're all always telling stories about things, and so the money stories is a really good example, and I agree, like framing it as what's your story about X, Y, Z. So I guess it does a couple of things, like it kind of allows you to remember specific instances or events that might inform your thinking about a particular topic, but then it also allows you to kind of look at them a bit more critically and go, oh, do I think this, or like did I just grow up believing this and never got around to updating my beliefs about it? So like money is quite a good example, actually. So I started out as a writer, and there's a big story in the world, especially in the more creative writing world, is that you can't make money as a writer. So that was the story that I always had in my head. You can't make money as a writer. You just can't. And then I worked for an agency where they charged like £2,400 plus VAT a day for things that I could do like quite easily. And I was like, oh, you can make money as a writer. Huh. Like update my system. Great. Okay, I can make money as a writer. Like, so that's an example of like, and there are all kinds of reasons why I might have that belief, and there's all kinds of things I will have heard, but I can examine critically my beliefs about something, and that invitation of a story rather than it being, can be quite an interesting way into that. So I don't know if that's quite what you were speaking to, Francis, but that's what popped out of the soup of therapy, poetry, purpose guiding, writing stuff that I do.
It's about choosing. It's about saying, well, it's about being conscious, isn't it? So I'm thinking also about the dreaded drama triangle of victim, persecutor and rescuer, and how you can just become existing in the narrative of, for example, the victim or the rescuer, and the work to do is to catch yourself as doing that, and to be able to say to yourself, I've been living in the narrative as a victim for too long. I choose now to step away from that. And that's not to say then that you have to choose to be one of the other two. It's about being able to extricate yourself from that triangle and be something other. But yeah, we can kind of just be living in these stories, as you say, for quite a long time, and suddenly we're taken off guard and we realise that in fact that isn't necessarily a true thing. There's no fact, there's no truth, capital T, with this stuff, and we can change up the story, because is there another way of telling it that's going to be more useful for us to go forward, sort of thing.
Definitely. And I guess for me that links in with like the thing we talked about before, which is like you do your own bit of work around your own story, and that can be quite private. Like that doesn't have to be, you don't have to do all this stuff like in public, but you do your own bit of work of reinterpreting your story, and then as a coach that's probably what's going to help you be able to help other people work with their stories. So I think it's that kind of dual effect, dual benefit again, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and you've spoken earlier, Craig says that he finds it troublesome to talk about how he was a pastor because he imagines that people are making all kinds of assumptions. I'm just going to put that imagines, Craig, because you've said they make, but it might be, what's important here is your feeling that they make all kinds of assumptions about him and his world for you that don't work, and also keep those people making those assumptions from being able to hear my stories. And I think I'm sure they might, some might not. It's about it for those people who are making those assumptions. Is there a way that as a storyteller we can make the links between why are you telling them you're a pastor to what you're doing now, how that's relevant and how it's relevant to them, and to compromise for anyone who doesn't have the imagination to do the work themselves, the kind of concerns that you think people have as to why on earth being a pastor is of any relevance in terms of where you are now or what kind of credibility you might have. I can see Simon nodding because this is something that Simon is about the connections, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's all about the way you frame it and the way you link it together. So an old business coach of mine, he worked in the church for many years, and not being a religious person myself, I didn't feel any affinity with that experience. I didn't have anything to add to it, didn't take away anything. But he then had a very stressful job at the council, and he was very high up in the council, and his job was essentially to go and tell people really bad news. That was what his job was. That's not what his job description said, but that's basically what his job was. So he had to go to shop owners and say, we're putting your business rates up, or we're removing the parking, or we're doing all this stuff. And he used all his work in the church to be able to talk with compassion and to see empathy and to find what he was described as like a light in a bad situation. And he was there to not deliver the bad news, but to offer the light and say, here is some bad news, but I'm also giving you that bad news wrapped up as an opportunity to do something else. And it was fascinating, some of the stuff he had to deal with, and the way he linked those two worlds together meant that actually you, after speaking with him for only a short while, you just saw it as a benefit, even if you weren't drawn to the, you know, religious side of his belief, personal beliefs, or his past of being involved in the church. You could just see how these two worlds merged, and he just did that with stories, and he learned how to tell stories through the church. So he just, do you know what I mean? He was always bringing these things up in ways that were like, that's a really good way of saying that, actually. Well done. You've just sewn that together really nicely. So I think if there is a way of bringing that in a positive way, it, you know, yes, it is going to put some people off, and maybe that's, you know, but as Seth Godin always says, you're not for everybody, and that's okay. So there's this idea that we have to kind of, you know, you can't be for everybody, and some people will be put off of that, but other people might be like, oh, that's interesting, tell me more about how that's got you to where you are. So yeah, it's about framing it,
I think so. And just like, you know, this is sort of starting to get into a little preview for the Purpose Chat on Friday, which you should all also come to. But like, there will be, you know, I think there's always like, there's core themes about what we do, and like the job title and the job description might look really different, but there's going to be like a core skill or a core interest, like that's a thread running through all the different things that we've done. And you know, I think it's sort of like about finding that. So for me, like, it might not be immediately obvious, like, why have I gone from being a copywriter to being a purpose or a therapist or whatever, but like, there's this core skill that's about kind of listening and hearing what people are saying underneath the words. And that's why, like, for example, in my copywriting world, I'm like a tone of voice specialist, and like, you know, I hear how people talk as well as what they're saying, and like, oh yeah, guess what, that's kind of what I do in therapy as well. So like that, you know, even if on the face of it the jobs feel and look quite different, there will be some element of it that's your purpose, I believe anyway, it's my personal belief, that is your purpose coming through. And then, you know, to use the David Brooks like second mountain metaphor, your second mountain purpose, you might use that skill in a really different way, but like you're going to have learnt it in and learnt it even better from doing it in this other world, if that makes sense. So that's how I see it anyway.
Yeah, I love it. It's a bit like a riddle. You know, mine is like, how does a degree in art history plus insurance plus HR plus international development plus marketing plus being a woman relate, or like what's the common thing, or like how, like what comes out of the wash? And it's like, God, I have no idea. Those things sound completely irrelevant from the next. But of course there's a thread, and there's a very good reason why without one of those things where I am now wouldn't make any sense at all. So that's the joy in a story, is that you're given permission through storytelling and being able to gift to people how those things are all connected, and then but you know, in doing that, you're giving people an invitation to connect for themselves things that they might, you know. And we talk about how you live out coaching in your marketing. We invite our coaches to think, how can you employ your coaching skills in your marketing so that people get a flavour of what it is to work with you. And if you're able to soften the blow of how something that seems completely discordant in relation to something else might actually be quite joyful, in relation to your own story, what you're gifting to your audience is that they can also live with compassion with things that might have been painful, as you started off talking about, Marianne, and how now they and making those connections is something that's something to celebrate, as opposed to feeling so icky and horrible about. Yes, so the gift of storytelling as well. That was a waffle. So on that note, we're actually at time.
I was going to say,
sort of things like being a pastor that they might like to share in the chat, they thought were completely irrelevant, but now they can feel that they feel they can share entirely relevant to where they are now, and they'd like to actually start talking about them more. Or has anyone else got any questions or thoughts before we leave off for today? We should also mention that Marianne will be doing things in the Better, Bolder, Braver community, and so if you want to find out more, you should join, and then that's very exciting in the new year. Simon, any further thoughts? Or Marianne, anything you'd like to make sure we cover today?
I think just that word gift, is I think your story, for all of us, as a human, your story is kind of a gift, and working with it and understanding it, and seeing what you've got even from challenging times can be really powerful. And then being willing to kind of take that and share it, appropriately in the right places with the right people. It genuinely is a kind of a gift to other people that you're giving, to sort of a gift of connection and of authenticity. So yeah, it's kind of powerful stuff. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think with story, it's one of those things that's never finished. It's never like, oh, I've done my story now, I don't have to think about that anymore. But I think your story is always evolving, and I think, you may work with a handful of clients for 6 months or a year or 10 years, and then be like, do you know what, I think my story has changed because I've changed, because my client's work has led me to see things in a slightly different way. My situation has changed. Your story is always going to be changing, and I think the fun of that is that it means that you're under no obligation to be the same person this year who you were last year, so you get to choose who you are and how you describe it. So I think there's a lot of fun to be had with story if you're willing to embrace that and not and take the plunge and move beyond those labels if that's where you are starting. But if you are starting from a different point, then obviously just having fun with it. But if you are the playwright, as it were, and you want to move beyond that, and as Marianne has illustrated today, there's a lot there, and I think your clients can really learn a lot about you and why that you're best placed to guide them on their journey. And I think that many people will first hear about a coach they want to work with by hearing a snippet of their story, or maybe a bit of their story and a bit more, and they'll think, oh, do you know what, I wish I could describe my story in that way. We'll be part of that process of coming to choose you as a coach. So I think there's a lot of benefits all round in looking at the story. Yes, so thank you very much, Marianne, for joining us today. It's been a really good conversation to understand more about your story, to delve into a little bit of our stories, but also thank everybody for joining us in the chat. Do join Marianne on Friday. If you're listening to this before Friday, there is a link in the chat. You can also watch the replay of it. That's the beauty of Crowdcast, isn't it? So if you're watching this on replay and you think, I've missed it, don't worry. Click the link in the chat, because that's also on Crowdcast, so then you can re-watch the replay of Marianne's conversation that is yet to come. There we go. Exciting, isn't it? There we go. I will also put a link to it in the show notes if you are listening to the podcast version of this. Again, you can still check out the replay of Marianne's chat there. If you'd like to get a little bit deeper into story, then do check out the guide on our website, all about story. And if you would like to work through a sort of more structured way of understanding your story and how that fits into your marketing, then do check out our coach's marketing journey on our website. Again, links will be in the show notes. So thank you very much for joining us and sharing everything today, and we will see you next time. Thanks, everybody.
And Marianne, if you'd like just to quickly let us know, or anyone else here, where else they
yes,
might like to find you. And obviously you've talked to wearing a number of hats, but is there anywhere in particular that you would like for people to find you, or a particular story that you would like for people to identify you with, a place to go?
Great question. What I'm going to do...
I'm sorry, because I know that you may not know what the answer to that is right now.
What I'm going to do is this is a bit of a... okay, this is like, don't do this, everyone. This is like probably the worst thing. I've got a mailing list, but I don't have the link to hand, so I'm going to put my email in the chat, and you're welcome to drop me a little note, and I will send you a link to a mailing list where I'll start to announce things that I'm doing in end of this year and kind of really into next year, including some potential pro bono places for some purpose guiding, some short courses on navigating by joy, some all kinds of bits and pieces. So drop me a note if you'd like to know more.
Love it. Excitingly unfolding in front of your eyes. Thank you very much, Marianne. It's been joyous as ever. Lots of love, and to everyone in the chat. See you next week.
See ya. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.